10 of the longest American prison terms ever served. Throughout the course of human history, some very lengthy prison sentences have been imposed. Sentencing guidelines, jury recommendations, victim statements, and judicial discretion can lead to severe punishments for convicted felons. For example, Thailand's Chamoy Thipyasa was given a 141,078-year sentence for running a pyramid scheme that scammed innocent citizens out of hundreds of millions of dollars. Though she was not able to serve the entirety of the sentence, her punishment still sent a strong message. Dudley Wayne Kaiser was another recipient of a long sentence. In the mid-70s, he was convicted of killing 3 people, including his wife and mother-in-law. In this case, the judge wanted to make it clear that Kaiser was an evil man, and so he was given 2 life sentences plus an additional 10,000 years in prison. Though Kaiser will never come close to serving 10,000 years, that sentence still stands as a warning. This list will explore the cases of 10 American prisoners who have served the longest sentences in the country's history. Number 10. Richard Honak, 64 years. In 1899, Richard Honak was apprehended for the homicide of a former schoolmate, Richard Kohler. The police suspected Honak and his accomplice, Herman Hundhausen, of setting a series of fires in the town of Herman, Missouri, but could not prove it until Kohler testified against Honak. Honak, wanting vengeance, plotted to murder Kohler and succeeded in doing so. The authorities quickly apprehended him and, in September, he confessed to the murder. He was sent to prison for the next 6 decades. On December 20, 1963, he was finally released on parole at the age of 85. Honak moved in with his niece and was surprised to see the advancements made while he was in prison. He enjoyed his freedom for almost 14 years before passing away in 1976, aged 97, with 2/3 of his lifetime having been spent behind bars. Number 9. William Hirons, 65 years. In 1945, Chicago police were confronted with a serial killer. They first discovered the body of Josephine Ross, who had died from unnatural causes. Soon after, Frances Brown was found murdered, causing a public uproar due to the message in lipstick on the wall near her body, which read, "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more, I cannot control myself." 6 weeks later, Suzanne Degnan, a 6-year-old girl, was killed and dismembered. After a few months, police had a breakthrough when William Hirons was arrested on burglary charges. Upon comparing his fingerprints to those found at the Degnan murder scene, Hirons confessed to the murders. He was tried and sentenced to life in prison. However, Hirons later maintained his innocence, claiming he had only confessed to avoid the death penalty. Residents of Chicago were divided in their opinion of Hirons' guilt, with some suggesting that a reporter had fabricated the lipstick message with the goal of selling newspapers. Nevertheless, Hirons' confession was enough for police and parole boards, and he was denied parole over 65 times throughout his sentence. Hirons eventually passed away in 2012, while serving his term in Dixon Correctional Center at the age of 83. Number 8. Warren Nutter, 65 years. At 18 years old, Warren Nutter made a series of decisions that would change his life forever. In 1956, he was arrested for a gas station robbery with a group of his friends and taken to an Iowa jail where he managed to escape. Nutter returned to the jail with a shotgun in an effort to free his accomplices. During the escape attempt, Nutter shot and killed police officer Harold Pierce, which resulted in him being arrested and charged with murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to death, making him the youngest ever person Iowa had ever ordered to die. However, his attorneys argued in an appeal that his childhood should be taken into consideration, and eventually the state of Iowa agreed and reduced his sentence to life in prison. A few years later, the death penalty was abolished in Iowa and Nutter remained in various prisons around the state for the next 65 years. He died in December 2021 at the age of 84, having been incarcerated for nearly 7 decades. Number 7. Sammy Robinson, 66 years. At just 16 years old, Sam Robinson was sent to the notorious Louisiana-Angola prison in 1953 after being convicted of an aggravated rape charge. In 1954, he killed another inmate during a fight in prison and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Robinson's stories of his time in the prison, which has a dark reputation, helped create its fearsome image. He recounted being set on fire in his cell, saying, "I don't know how I survived." In the 1970s, his original rape conviction was overturned by an appeals court, but he was not released from prison due to his murder charge. As he grew older, Robinson dreamed of being set free, expressing optimism that he could make a living and start all over again, due to the wisdom he'd acquired over the years. Unfortunately, this was not to be, and Robinson tragically died in jail in 2019, having spent 66 years of his life behind bars. Number 6. Johnson Van Dyke Grigsby, 66 years. Johnson Van Dyke Grigsby first went to prison way back in 1908. That year, he had been playing cards in an Indiana bar when another man caused a disturbance. The other man accused Grigsby of cheating and challenged him to a fight. The two tussled, and Grigsby stabbed the man. Then, he went back to playing cards. The man didn't die right away, though. And he didn't go to the hospital, either. Instead, he simply sat up at the bar while bleeding from his stab wounds. A few hours later, it was too late to save him. What had at first been a non-life-threatening stabbing turned into a mortal wound, and the man died. The man was a crazy man, Grigsby recalled in an interview years later. He couldn't be talked to. Stayed at the bar like a crazy man or something, instead of getting to a hospital. He was a fool, is what he was. Why? Everybody knew that. Police didn't see it quite that way. They arrested Grigsby on a second-degree murder charge and hauled him to jail. He was convicted of the charge and sentenced to prison. For the next 66 years, he stayed there. After nearly 7 full decades behind bars, Grigsby resigned himself to the fact that he'd never see freedom again. Then, one day in 1974, guards came to him with some news: he'd been paroled. The convicted murderer couldn't believe it. He was 89 years old and had spent more than 3/4 of his life in the Indiana State Penitentiary. But the guards weren't playing a prank. Grigsby really was getting out. He was released and eventually was moved to a nursing home in the state to receive medical care in his old age. From there, he enjoyed relative anonymity along with his newfound freedom. Amazingly, he appears to have lived more than a decade after being released. Genealogy records indicate he died in 1987. Number 5. Walter Bork, 67+ years. By the end of it all, Walter Bork may wind up at the very top of this infamous list. His prison tale started way back in 1955. That year, he was convicted of the murder of a 4-year-old Boston girl named Patricia Johnson. Cops say he killed her because he was afraid she was going to tell someone he'd been molesting her. He had been just 17 years old at the time of her murder. He'd even volunteered to be part of the search party that looked for the little girl while she was still thought to be missing. But once her murder came to light, police quickly closed in. On the witness stand at his own trial, Bork copped to the terrible crime. "I wish someone had come down the stairs and stopped me," Bork said of his awful choice to sexually assault the little girl. "I was scared of the father. The whole time I've been here, I've been thinking about it." A jury promptly sent him to prison, and there, he had even more time to think about his actions. In 1979, he was granted a 72-hour leave from prison. It was a very brief taste of freedom and no more. After 3 days away from jail, Bork returned to the prison walls and kept serving his time. Over the years, he began to lose faith that he'd ever get out. He was denied freedom time and again at parole hearings. Parole finally came through years later, but Bork quickly messed up his chance to redeem whatever life he had left. Probation officers discovered he'd had contact with minors, which violated the conditions of his very brief release. Plus, he was soon caught with a stolen check. An unforgiving judge promptly sent him right back to jail to continue doing time. By the end of 2022, Bork had served more than 67 years in prison, and counting. Number 4. Joseph Lygon, 68 years. Joseph Lygon, at only 15 years old, was sent to jail for a crime he had been accused of, though he was not aware of the consequences of his actions. In 1953, he moved from the Deep South to Philadelphia, but soon found himself in a situation that changed his life forever. That Friday night, he and a group of acquaintances got into a brawl that left 2 dead and 6 seriously injured. Unfortunately, he was charged with murder, convicted, and incarcerated, ending any chance of a free life. More than half a century ago, Lygon was convicted for a crime he committed as a teen. But at the time, his fate was sealed. He was facing life in prison without a chance of parole. Despite the grim outlook, Lygon accepted his fate. In his own words, he didn't even realize parole could be a possibility. However, after 15 years of tireless work from attorneys, the legal briefs were finally ready, and Lygon's case was finally heard. After 68 years of incarceration, the 83-year-old Lygon was released to the custody of his sister and her daughter in February 2021. It was a long road, but his incredible story shows that the justice system can be changed. Number 3. John Phillips, 69 years. John Phillips's case is one of the more astonishing and lesser-known prison sentences. It began in 1952 when the North Carolina native was 18 years old. He was arrested and charged with first-degree rape after allegedly assaulting a 4-year-old girl. After interviewing him, authorities noticed that something was amiss. In modern times, someone like Phillips would be classified as developmentally disabled. However, back then, police were less delicate in their terminology. He was sent to a state mental hospital for evaluation and labeled a moron. Despite being deemed to have the intellectual and emotional abilities of a 7-year-old, a plea of guilty was entered on Phillips' behalf and he was sentenced to prison. Phillips has been in prison for an astonishing 7 decades, with more than 2/3 of his life spent in North Carolina mental hospitals, prison wards, and jail. In 1991, he had already been locked up for 39 years, an incredibly long sentence for a non-murder case, and told a journalist that he would stay there until he died. Fast forward to 2019, and he is now known as Peanut among his fellow inmates. Despite the long years, he remains behind bars and is expected to reach the 7-decade mark in 2023. Number 2. Paul Guidel, 69 years. Paul Guidel's harsh childhood began in 1894. After being orphaned at just 7, he moved to New York City during his teenage years and became a bellhop at a prestigious hotel. Unfortunately, he couldn't keep up with the job's demands, and was fired soon after. In a fit of despair, he decided to break into the home of a wealthy Wall Street financier, intending to knock him out with chloroform and steal expensive items. Sadly, he miscalculated and suffocated the man during the botched robbery. Unfortunately, the crime was taken very seriously due to the man's close friendship with the Manhattan District Attorney. Guidel was quickly captured, arrested, and sentenced to life in prison for the fateful deed. For decades, Guidel was confined to the walls of Sing Sing prison, spending 69 years of his life there. In 1974, the New York Times examined his case and he expressed his guilt and confusion over the murder he committed. Although parole boards were unsure of Guidel's potential for rehabilitation, they eventually decided that he had paid his debt to society in 1980 and released him at the age of 86. He was given a place to live in a nursing home and spent the last 7 years of his life there before passing away in 1987. Number 1. Francis Smith, 72 years. In 1924, Francis Smith was born and lived anonymously for the majority of the first quarter of his life. However, this changed in 1949 when he got embroiled in one of Connecticut's most notorious murder cases. A 25-year-old Smith stood accused of murdering a night security guard at the Indian Harbor Yacht Club in Greenwich. Evidence suggested that the crime was committed by 2 culprits, and police soon arrested George Loudon. Although Loudon initially refused to expose his accomplice, he eventually accepted a plea deal, implicating Smith. Loudon was incarcerated for 17 years, until his release in 1966. With the testimony of Loudon, police charged Francis Smith with the shooting. From the outset, many believed Francis Smith was the victim of a police witch hunt. Rumors swirled that he was coerced into implicating himself, given his reputation as a petty criminal in Greenwich. Witnesses retracted their initial statements and another man even confessed to being the second shooter, but the court still seemed intent on punishing Smith. It seemed clear to many that the police saw an opportunity to make Smith pay for his past indiscretions. After being tried and convicted of a murder, Smith faced the ultimate consequence, a death sentence. For a while, he was kept on death row awaiting his fate. Despite coming within 24 hours of his execution, Smith was ultimately granted a reprieve when the sentence was commuted to life in prison. For the following 72 years, Smith served time for his crime, not once stepping out of the prison walls. After all that time, in 2022, the parole board finally decided to grant him parole. Smith was 97 years old by then and was ready to experience freedom again. He walked out of the prison, a free man after more than 7 decades of being behind bars.